really. And in the spirit of having a respectful debate, earlier I spoke to Jayne Ozanne, who is a former government LGBTQ plus advisor. She resigned from that role over her concerns about the government's strategy and direction on issues of LGBT rights. She opposes the Equality and Human Rights Commission, suggesting that a change in the law is at all necessary when it comes to trans people. And I just want to play you the conversation that we had earlier. Firstly, there are kind of two objections, I think, to this letter that was written earlier in the week by the EHRC. The moral objection about how it treats trans people and the practical objection about how this would actually work. Can we talk about the moral objection first? How do you feel about the tone of this letter, and what is it that you object to in terms of the way it treats trans people?
So, Paul, I think the context of this letter is really important. It comes after the reaccreditation of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, where there were significant concerns raised about the past behaviour of the EHRC, and where the UN itself, the Accreditation Committee, basically told off the EHRC for the way that they had failed to engage with the sector, for the lack of representation of trans voices. And many of us in the sector, received letters from the EHRC after their reaccreditation saying, look, we want to reset. We want to work with you in a whole new way. We want to ensure we consult with you. And yet the very first action they do is to produce a letter which absolutely sends shivers of fear through the trans community with no consultation whatsoever with any of us in the sector. So this adds to this picture of them being extremely anti-trans and following a government agenda.
So what do you think is anti-trans about this particular letter this week? Why did it send shivers down the spines of some people?
Well, looking to redefine sex from legal sex, which is the standard international norm, to this concept which is impossible to define as biological sex, and indeed impossible to police, shows a desire to move away from standard international norms and puts fear into the trans community because they know that people will be judging them by what they look like, policing bathroom spaces, policing, public spaces in a way that we've never done before. And it's the messaging that this gives to a community that has seen sustained attack. We know from the government's own figures that hate crime against the trans community is at an all-time high. And that even the government's, stats have said, their report says, is fueled by the social media rhetoric that is being ramped up against them.
And why do you think it's impossible to define biological sex? Because what Baroness Falkner argues in her letter, and what lots of other people argue, is that actually defining sex is straightforward. You know, the genitalia, essentially, that you're born with predominantly determine your biological sex, and gender is actually the bit that becomes more complicated.
But, Paul, they don't. And it's that belief which is the real issue, this ignorance around the whole issue of biological sex. You know, there's only research and science has shown there's over 40 different sex characteristics. And, it's not just a matter of simply looking at someone's genitalia. We've got chromosomes, we've got all forms of biological matters. That's why we have intersex. That's why we know that gender dysphoria exists. And this simplistic, rather, dare I say, fairy tale view that you just look at a body and decide what sex it is, went out with the ark. Science has shown that this is completely changed, and we understand that sexuality, gender, chromosomes, hormones, it's a far, far more complex picture.
But then what Baroness Falkner argues is that if you strip sex and gender apart and you treat them as two different characteristics, then it can actually help solve some of the really visceral rows that have emerged in recent years. So if you say, for example, that sex is one thing and that's what you're born as, a man or a woman, then if you're able then to use a toilet as a man or a woman, and gender over there can be self-defined and people can change their gender if they want to, but ultimately it doesn't allow them to then access those single-sex spaces. I mean, she believes that would actually help solve some of these problems.
Well, she may believe that, but she's actually creating problems, and she's trying to address something that doesn't need fixing. What she's actually suggesting is that trans men, men who look to all intents like men with beards and who have now penises, should be using women's spaces, which is utterly against what she's suggesting. So I do think she's oversimplifying this. She needs to go and have some, dare I say, some lessons in biology. She needs to take the account of the science and the medical experts who will explain to her that biological sex is not as simple as she'd like to make out. She was asked this week if she would define what biological sex was, and she just laughed. So it shows to me that she doesn't understand what she's actually supposed to be in charge of, that she would do well to engage with the trans community itself, understand the implications of what she's suggesting, and also look to the international community who've been, we're not alone in dealing with this. And the European Union, Finland this week went ahead and agreed that self-determination was the right way to go. So there's an awful lot of precedents here we should draw on.
What do you really think is behind all of this? Because there have been accusations this week that the EHRC is politically biased, that the government's hand is involved in all of this. Do you think there's truth in that?
Well, I think there's two matters going on here. There's a failing Tory party who want to deflect the public opinion away from the chaos they've created. And I speak as someone who's apolitical here, and stoking woke wars has been an aim that they themselves have talked. They want to have a war on woke. But I also think, and perhaps Baroness Falkner, dare I say, and some of her colleagues might fall into this category. There is a group of feminists of a certain age who seem to think that trans women cause a threat to women and girls. And I speak as a woman who sadly has been very open about the fact she's been raped, who's had sexual abuse, and I know that the greatest threat I face is from ignorance, and that my trans female friends, my trans women friends, are the ones who understand that more than anybody, and the people I feel safest amongst.
Do you think the challenge for you and for others who share your view is that for a lot of the population, the general population out there, they do think it's as simple as Baroness Falkner points out when it comes to the very basics of this debate? I'm not talking about the intricacies, but the very basics, that you can be born a man or a woman. And I think the majority of the population, polling has shown, is they're very accepting of people who want to transition and change their gender identity, and there's a lot of love and support for trans people out there. Do you think the challenge for you, though, and people who share your view, is that actually the vast majority of the population do think that biological sex is as simple as Baroness Falkner points out, that it's quite easy when a baby is born to determine whether it is a female or a male, and that is different to gender? And I think there's a lot of love and respect out there for trans people among the broader population, for the idea that someone may wish to transition and to change their gender identity. But I think a lot of people do think that biological sex is quite easy to define, and it's not Baroness Falkner that's complicating it, but it's perhaps you and others who share your view who are complicating it. What do you think of that?
Well, I think there is a lot of ignorance around trans people. I think we as society need to educate ourselves. Ignorance is not an excuse for making poor decisions. And I fear that we are back in the days of Section 28, when there's a lot of ignorance around lesbian, gay and bisexual people. And we have to help people understand that this isn't as simplistic as they'd like to think. You're right that research shows that the majority of the community, the majority of the public, the non-LGBT community, are very pro-trans. And I think they're beginning to understand that things are not as simplistic as they'd like them to be. The understanding now around intersex and around gender dysphoria, but also around the dangers of judging people by what they look like. You know, I have a lot of trans people who pass terribly well. I have a lot of non-binary lesbian friends who people think are trans. You know, and if we start trying to police public spaces by what we think people look like, because we're not going to be asking people to prove who they are before they go into a changing room or a toilet, we're getting into a society that I think starts to look at difference rather than acceptance. And I do think we have to take people on a journey.
And that is one of the practical implications that stands out to me, is that under this change that Baroness Falkner is proposing, a trans man would be able to go into a woman's toilet. So women who are going about their business in the toilet would see potentially a trans man walking in with a beard, and they would have no idea whether that was a biological man, to use Baroness Falkner's definition, or a trans man. They would see a person with a beard and have absolutely no idea if that person is trans or not. And that for me is kind of one of the big practical flaws in her argument.
Well, it is, but actually the sad reality, Paul, is that most trans people I know would not go anywhere near a toilet or a changing room. They are fearful. We're dealing with people whose lives are hell already, and we're just adding to that judgment and hell. And many are looking, sadly, to even leave the UK because of the fear levels that they're feeling. I've got a friend who wants to work in government and wants to work and help educate people, but she's saying, how can I do that if I can't even go to the toilet whilst I'm out and about? So, we've got to look at the real threat to people's lives here. And I keep coming back to the fact that is ignorance. It's not trans people. They are the people who are on the receiving end of hate and violence and judgment. And as a society, we owe it to them to educate ourselves, to stand with them and to protect them. And that's why I am speaking out, and I do hope many others will. Thousands of nuns in the United States today have sent out a letter showing support, because they know that it's about time that we stood firm for those who are marginalised and being oppressed.
Yep, we're all human. Jayne Ozanne, thanks so much for joining me. That was Jayne Ozanne talking to me earlier, who's a former LGBTQ plus advisor to